People do not understand that this is very strong.
He's got to be a great joke. Bill, that was a tap.
From hair pulling and groin strikes in a chaotic cage to billion-dollar stadium shows, MMA has mutated 7 times. But do you know the dark secrets that defined each era?
Again, a couple of blows and McCarthy steps in.
But before we get into the details, smash that like button and subscribe to the Band-Aid Battalion, where we break down the fight games so you don't have to. Now, let's dive in. Era 1, the Wild West, 1993 to 2000.
He's got to be a great joke. It's over. It's over. That was just the voice is not letting him go. He wants to make sure.
To understand how we arrived at the polished billion-dollar juggernaut that is modern MMA, we have to look at the blood-soaked canvas of 1993. This wasn't a sport yet. It was a dark experiment. This was the Wild West. When the UFC launched in Denver, Colorado, the concept of mixed martial arts didn't exist in the public consciousness. It was marketed as no holds barred, and that wasn't just a catchy tagline. It was a warning. There were no weight classes. You had sumo wrestlers weighing 600 pounds facing off against Savate kickboxers weighing 200. There were no judges, no time limits, and essentially no rules. If you think the violence today is intense, you have to imagine a time when the referee was purely ornamental. In this era, groin strikes were legal. Hair pulling was a legitimate strategy. Headbutting was part of the game. It was raw, visceral, and terrifyingly real. The inaugural events looked less like professional sports and more like organized street brawls structured into a tournament format. And amidst this chaos, one man changed the world forever. He didn't look like a fighter. He looked like an accountant or a physics teacher. Royce Gracie walked out in a white GI, looking calm while surrounded by monsters. The world watched in shock as this skinny Brazilian used a mysterious art called jiu-jitsu to strangle, twist, and submit giants who had no idea what was happening to them. Gracie didn't just win, he dominated, capturing the tournament crown by submitting Art Jimerson, Ken Shamrock, and Gerard Gordo in a single night.
He just tapped out.
Did he?
But here is where the story takes a dark turn. While the pay-per-view audience was fascinated, the outside world was horrified. Senator John McCain famously labeled the spectacle human cockfighting. The political backlash was swift and brutal. The UFC was kicked off cable television. They were banned from holding events in major states. The Wild West era wasn't just about fighting in the cage. It was a fight for survival in the courtrooms. The promotion was forced underground, holding events in small gymnasiums in the Deep South just to keep the lights on. The sport was alive, but it was on life support. And if you thought the violence in America was crazy, you have no idea what was happening on the other side of the world. Era 2, the Pride/Superfight era, late 90s to 2007.
He's out! The fight is over!
While the UFC was suffocating under US regulations, Japan was about to launch the most spectacular and arguably the most violent era in MMA history. Welcome to the Pride FC era. This was not a cage in a gym. This was a pristine white ring inside the massive Tokyo Dome, surrounded by 50,000 screaming fans. Pride wasn't just a fight, it was a rock concert. It was pageantry. It was the super fight era. But don't let the lasers and the screaming announcer lady fool you. The rules in Pride were savage. Unlike the UFC, which was trying to clean up its image, Pride leaned into the brutality. In this era, if an opponent was on their hands and knees, you could kick them in the face like a soccer ball. You could jump in the air and stomp on their head. It changed the entire dynamic of combat. This golden age gave birth to the heavyweights that still haunt our nightmares today. We witnessed the rise of the last emperor, Fedor Emelianenko. A man with the demeanor of a stone statue. Fedor combined devastating sambo, grappling with lightning-fast hooks to remain undefeated for a decade. He was the king of kings. And that's not all. We saw the terrifying Mirko Cro Cop, a Croatian anti-terrorist cop whose left high kick was responsible for some of the scariest knockouts ever recorded. As the saying went, right leg hospital, left leg cemetery. We saw Wanderlei Silva, the axe murderer, destroying opponents with knees in the clinch while the Japanese crowd roared.
Valiantly trying to avoid this brutal onslaught.
This era is often ranked as the greatest by purists because it focused on the spectacle of best versus best. There was a mystique to Pride. The fighters felt like video game characters come to life. However, behind the curtain, things were crumbling. Rumors of Yakuza involvement, fixed fights, and financial mismanagement plagued the organization. While Pride had the talent and the showmanship, they didn't have the sustainable business model. The super fight era was burning bright, but it was burning out. And what happened next would shift the balance of power back to the West in a way nobody expected. Era 3, the UFC consolidation era, 2005 to 2010.
Combinations, uppercuts, shoulders on the handstand,
By the mid-2000s, the landscape was fractured. You had the glitz of Japan and the grit of America. But two brothers from Las Vegas, Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, along with their friend Dana White, had a vision. They didn't just want to be a player in the game, they wanted to own the game. This is the consolidation era. The UFC had been bleeding money, but they made a gamble that paid off. More on that in a moment. Flush with new confidence, they did the unthinkable. They bought Pride FC. It was the moment that shook the foundation of combat sports. For years, fans argued on internet forums about who would win between the UFC champions and the Pride champions. Suddenly, those fantasy matchups became reality. The UFC absorbed the roster of its biggest rival. Legends like Mauricio Shogun Rua, Quinton Rampage Jackson, and Dan Henderson migrated to the octagon. But this era wasn't just about buying talent. It was about the evolution of the athlete. We moved past the one-dimensional fighters of the Wild West. We saw the rise of the hybrids. Georges St-Pierre, GSP, began his reign of terror at welterweight. GSP wasn't a brawler, he was a scientist. He broke down his opponents, mixing elite wrestling with dynamic striking, treating the sport like a chess match where checkmate meant a broken orbital bone. At the same time, Anderson, the Spider Silva, turned the octagon into his personal playground. He did things that shouldn't be physically possible, dropping his hands, dodging punches by millimeters, and knocking people out with jabs moving backward. And then, a monster arrived. Brock Lesnar. A massive WWE superstar with a legitimate wrestling background, Lesnar bridged the gap between entertainment and sport. He brought millions of new eyes to the product. UFC 100 in 2009 became the biggest event in company history at the time, proving that MMA had officially arrived as a major league sport. The talent was unified. The champions were global stars. But the UFC realized that to truly take over the world, they needed to capture the hearts of the casual fan. Era 4, the tap-out/Zuffa era, 2002 to 2009. To understand how the UFC got the money to buy Pride and sign Lesnar, we have to rewind slightly and look at the cultural explosion that saved the sport. This is the tap-out era, named after the clothing brand that plastered its logo on every t-shirt, bumper sticker, and fighter's shorts. This era was defined by a specific aesthetic: heavy rock music, just bleed, face paint, and a rebellious attitude. In the early 2000s, the UFC was arguably dead. The Fertittas were millions in the hole. As a last-ditch effort, they funded a reality TV show called The Ultimate Fighter. It aired on Spike TV right after WWE Raw. The concept was simple: lock a bunch of fighters in a house, give them alcohol, and make them fight for a contract. It worked. The Season 1 finale between Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar is widely credited as the most important fight in history. It was a sloppy, bloody, heart-pounding war on live cable TV. People flipping channels stopped and stared. They realized these weren't animals, they were warriors. This era built the first generation of true crossover celebrities. Chuck the Iceman Liddell became the face of the sport. With his blue ice shorts, mohawk, and devastating overhand right, Liddell was the perfect anti-hero. His rivalry with Tito Ortiz, the Huntington Beach bad boy, was the first real soap opera of MMA. The trash talk was real, the hatred was palpable, and the pay-per-view buys went through the roof. During this period, the sport went from an underground secret to a fraternity house staple. If you were a young male in the mid-2000s, you watched the UFC. This era laid the groundwork for the brand building that sustains the company today. But as the popularity grew, the sport needed to mature. The days of nu metal and mohawks were fading. A new level of professionalism was on the horizon. Era 5, the UFC on Fox/WEC absorption, 2011 to 2015.
Do you want to take a chance and risk getting knocked out? Oh my God!
Up until 2011, the UFC was largely a land of giants. Heavyweights and light heavyweights dominated the posters. But quietly, in a smaller promotion called the WEC, the little guys were putting on the best fights in the world. This brings us to the Fox era and the technical evolution. The UFC absorbed the WEC, and suddenly the speed of the sport doubled. The bantamweights and featherweights arrived, and they brought a level of technique that the big men couldn't match. We were introduced to Jose Aldo, the King of Rio, who chopped down opponents' legs with the force of a baseball bat. We saw Dominic Cruz, whose footwork was so complex it looked like he was dancing. We saw Uriah Faber, the California kid, bringing charisma to the lower weight classes. This era was marked by a massive broadcast deal with Fox Sports. MMA was no longer just on pay-per-view or niche cable channels, it was on network television. Fighters started wearing suits to press conferences. The production value skyrocketed. But the biggest shock of this era came from a demographic Dana White swore would never step foot in the octagon. For years, Dana said women would never fight in the UFC. Then he met rowdy Ronda Rousey. Rousey didn't just open the door for women, she kicked it off the hinges. She was an Olympic judoka with an attitude that couldn't be ignored. She finished opponents in seconds, collecting arms like trophies. She became a mainstream darling, appearing in movies and on late-night talk shows. Rousey proved that star power has no gender. This era was about expansion. The UFC went global, holding shows in Brazil, Europe, and Australia. The skill level was higher than ever. Fighters were becoming true mixed martial artists, seamlessly blending striking and grappling. But with more money and more scrutiny came a need for cleanliness. The sport was about to undergo a massive detox that would change physiques and careers overnight. Era 6, the USADA/Reebok era, 2015 to 2020. In 2015, the UFC was preparing for a multi-billion-dollar sale. To make the company attractive to corporate buyers, they had to scrub away the grit. Welcome to the USADA and Reebok era, the era of the cleanup. First came USADA, United States Anti-Doping Agency. The UFC implemented the strictest drug testing program in professional sports. Almost immediately, things changed. Fighters who looked like superheroes suddenly looked human. Cardio tanked. Knockout power vanished. Legends of the previous eras began popping for banned substances, tarnishing legacies and altering championship histories. It was a painful transition, but it legitimized the sport as a fair athletic competition. Then came the Reebok deal. The UFC banned outside sponsors. The colorful, unique fight shorts covered in logos were replaced by uniform kits that looked like Power Ranger costumes. Fighters lost their individual flair and a huge chunk of their income. The backlash from fans and athletes was severe. But amidst this corporate sterilization, one man became bigger than the brand itself: Conor McGregor. This was the era of the champ. McGregor's rise was unlike anything sports had ever seen. He didn't just defeat opponents. He dismantled them psychologically before the first bell rang. He predicted the round, the minute, and the method. He knocked out the decade-long champion Jose Aldo in 13 seconds. He moved up in weight. He fought Nate Diaz in a rivalry that transcended the sport. He became the first fighter to hold 2 belts simultaneously. This era was defined by the clash between the polished corporate image the UFC wanted and the uncontrollable chaos of its biggest star. It culminated in UFC 229, Khabib versus McGregor. It was the classic unstoppable force meeting the immovable object.
Tomorrow night, I'm gonna smash your boy, guys. I'm gonna smash your boy.
The build-up was toxic, personal, and dark. The fight itself was a mauling, with Khabib Nurmagomedov asserting his dominance. We saw the rise of the unbeatens during this time. While McGregor was the star, Khabib was the reality check. John Jones continued his dominance inside the cage while battling demons outside of it. It was a time of high drama, massive money, and the realization that the UFC was now a global powerhouse. Era 7. The new generation, current era. 2020, present. And then the world stopped. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the NBA, the NHL, the Olympics, and the world. But Dana White refused to fold. While other sports sat on the sidelines, the UFC secured a private island in Abu Dhabi. This birthed the current era, the era of resilience and the new breed. Fight Island wasn't just a marketing gimmick. It was a symbol that the UFC was bulletproof. For months, we watched fights in empty arenas. We heard every bone snap, every heavy breath, every cornerman's instruction. It was intimate, gritty, and technically fascinating. But what truly defines this current era is the sheer level of skill. The days of being a specialist are dead. You cannot just be a kickboxer or just a wrestler anymore. The new champions are problems that have no easy solutions. We have witnessed the passing of the torch. The legends of the Fox and Zuffa eras, Aldo, Cruz, Edgar, have faded or retired. In their place, a new wave of killers has risen. We are seeing the dominance of the Dagestani style, led by Islam Makhachev, who took the torch from Khabib and added elite striking to the suffocating grappling. We are seeing the anomaly that is Alex Pereira, a stone-faced kickboxer who hunted his rival Israel Adesanya across 2 different sports, captured 2 belts in record time, and saved UFC 300 with a knockout that shook the earth. We are seeing the rise of Ilia Topuria, a man who represents the perfect fusion of modern MMA, knockout power in his hands and black belt grappling on the floor. And speaking of UFC 300, in April 2024, the promotion proved it is entering a new golden age. Max Holloway, pointing to the center of the cage in the dying seconds of the fight to trade blows with Justin Gaethje, wasn't just a highlight, it was a statement. It showed that despite the corporate money and the ESPN deals, the spirit of the Wild West is still alive in the hearts of these fighters. This era is ranked by its difficulty. The gap between the champion and the number 15 ranked fighter has never been smaller. Any mistake results in a loss. We are in the era of the complete martial artist. So, Band-Aid Battalion, which era was the best? Do you miss the soccer kicks and freak shows of Pride? Or do you prefer the elite skill level of the modern game? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget, keep your hands up, chin down, and subscribe to the Band-Aid Battalion MMA for more combat history. We'll see you at the next bell.